Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Commonwealth Communities Symposium. I'm Catherine Burgess, the VP of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. We're very excited to host today's event. It's a partnership between Smart Growth America and LOCUS with the support of the Barr Foundation. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special thank you to the Barr Foundation for supporting this event and a related program of work in smart growth, transit access, and sustainable equitable development. Today's event is the first in a series of 4 virtual events specifically designed for Massachusetts elected officials and local government staff, although we welcome all who would enjoy being a part of the conversations. Before we begin, a few quick technology reminders. We'd encourage you to enter your questions throughout the event into the chat or the questions area. Our speakers will be taking questions throughout the event within their presentations, as well as at a dedicated time at the end of the session. I'll shortly be introduced Doug Landry, who will be our MC and who is the president of LOCUS, Massachusetts. LOCUS is the nation's leading coalition of triple bottom line real estate developers and investors who are committed to advocating for policies to advance smart growth and sustainable equitable development. LOCUS is a division of Smart Growth America, which is a national nonprofit dedicated to advancing sustainable equitable development. We envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a neighborhood which is healthy, resilient, and prosperous. Land use and development are critical in our efforts to achieving this mission and to addressing many of the most pressing societal challenges of our time, including climate change, racial equity, and public health. Our series of 4 events within the Commonwealth Community Symposium will address many of these important topics, as well as tactics to address all of these issues within your work in local government, development, or planning. We'd welcome you to share this event and others in the series with your colleagues and your networks, and to others who are unable to attend today. We'll be circulating the recordings tomorrow, and we'll also be sending out related programming materials later this fall. And with that, I'd like to introduce Doug Landry. Doug is a longtime member of the LOCUS Steering Committee and has since 2018 been the president of LOCUS Massachusetts, in addition to his role as the lead of the Langen Engineering Firm's Boston office. Doug has been instrumental in putting together the content and strategic direction for this symposium. Thank you so much, Doug, and enjoy the symposium today.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome to you to Smart Growth America, the family here in LOCUS. Catherine has just joined us in the past few months, and we're just really glad and happy that she's with the organization. Just to put a little more color on what Catherine was saying, again, Doug Landry, as Catherine said, I am the Boston office lead for Langen Engineering here in Boston. That's my day job, but my passion really is around the work that LOCUS does nationwide. We do advocacy work mostly at the federal level to encourage and promote policies and programs that promote walkability, that promote transit-oriented development, that promote equity in our patterns of development across the country. I am the president of the chapter here in Massachusetts, fledgling as it is, but there's a lot going on here, and I really do want to underscore the thanks to the Barr Foundation, who helped to underwrite the effort here. This is really technical assistance for you folks. It was conceived as a sort of a post-COVID set of strategies that could be shared with local practitioners. When we were developing the symposium and the themes that are going to kind of weave throughout the 4 sessions, the post-COVID world, where are we? What state are we going to be in when we deliver this series of seminars? Massachusetts, as we all know, has fared better, than most of the country in terms of it coming out of the COVID crisis. A lot of tragedy, of course, with everybody who has been affected by the disease. But in terms of economic recovery, again, Massachusetts, with its solid foundation of our healthcare, life sciences, educational institutions, we kind of start at a different foundation than I think some more unfortunate parts of the country. Nevertheless, COVID did hit here. We were forced to do certain things, stay home, work from home, and kind of look inward a little bit in our communities. And I think that reawakened everybody about what's around us and how we can take advantage of the things that we sort of maybe rediscovered along the way. The title of the symposium emergent strategies. That's a deliberate, or our emergent future. That's a deliberate word there because we toyed with it. Emerging might have been a little more common usage, but the difference between emerging and emergent is subtle but very important. Emerging is it's growing, it's on a pace, you're trying to get to a certain recognition level. I think personally, Massachusetts was there pre-COVID in terms of our economy and some of the things that we're working on from an equity point of view. Emergent means you've been through something together. So what do we do next, given the reality that we just came through? So that's really the theme that we're trying to weave through these series of symposiums. So I'm really excited for these next 4 series. We spent a lot of time curating the panels and the panelists here. These are some really amazing folks that we've pulled together for each one of these 4 sessions. You're going to hear from folks in Massachusetts. You're going to hear some folks from outside of the region to give some, perspective. We don't want to have an echo chamber here, which we sometimes do in this state. It's good to bring in other perspectives. So I'm really excited about that. And then the participants here, we have a broad range of folks who have signed up for the seminar. Western Massachusetts, Egremont, North Adams. We have folks from the North Shore, South Shore, Boston, Worcester, Central Massachusetts, an awesome range of folks. And as Catherine said, there's a few folks from outside of Massachusetts. So welcome. We hope you can learn some things that we're doing here in Massachusetts and take those back to your communities as well. So with that, I do want to start the introductions here for the speakers and our panelists today. If you do have questions, again, please put them in the chat box. We will answer them after each one of the sessions, and then we'll have a general larger Q&A at the end. So make sure you do jot those down, and we'll get going. Okay, so the typical introductions here with bios, I think they were provided, I hope, with the introductory packages here that everybody signed up for. But as we introduce each speaker, we're asking them to give their definition of walkability. What does walkability mean to them as they introduce themselves? So our first speaker is going to be Stacy Vitell, and Stacy is the Executive Director of Walk Boston. So welcome, Stacy. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you believe walkability is.
Thanks so much, Doug, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak with all of you today. So my name is Stacy Vitell. I'm the Executive Director of Walk Boston. Walk Boston is a statewide pedestrian advocacy organization where we work with municipal staff, community-based organizations, residents to make their cities and towns more walkable. My background is in landscape architecture and urban planning. And I come to you from Lexington, Massachusetts, where in my home office, where we are currently virtual and looking to become less virtual as the pandemic continues to wane. My definition of walkability is very simple. I want to be able to walk outside my door. I want to feel safe, both from vehicular traffic, so smooth sidewalks and a way to cross the street, but also I want to feel safe personally. So my personal safety is important too, to make sure that I feel comfortable. I want to have somewhere to go, and I want to be able to meet neighbors and new people and have community across this, as I'm moving. So it's really about the infrastructure, the people, and a sense of belonging.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. Next, we will be hearing from the Honorable Robin Lewis. Robin is a state delegate for the Maryland legislature representing District 46 in Baltimore. And we were really, really lucky to find her and have her speak from her perspective with some of the walkability stuff she's been doing down in Maryland. So Robin, introduce yourself, please, and let us know your definition of walkability.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks to the Smart Growth community for welcoming me. My name is Robin Lewis. I'm a state delegate in the Maryland General Assembly representing District 46, which includes all of the waterfront neighborhoods around Baltimore's historic harbor. Coming to you live from Baltimore this morning, and I'm really, really happy to be here. So my definition of walkability really is that walkability is a basic human right, like the right to self-determination, bodily autonomy, any other human right that you could list. Why do I say that? Because without the freedom, the sense of physical safety to move around in public space, every other right is abridged in some way. Walkability is the heart of equity in public policy. It's why, even though I'm a public health researcher by training, the essential human right, that core quality of walkability is something that as an elected official, I have a special duty to protect and expand. So that's where I'm at. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin. Really looking forward to your remarks later. The Honorable John Robert Smith, some of you may know John Robert. He's been up here in Massachusetts several times doing some technical assistance along the way. I think last time was the Opportunity Zone Academy, and he was, I think you were delegated to Fitchburg and that cohort of folks, I think, or maybe it was the Greenfield folks, I forget. Anyway, John Robert Smith, Senior Policy Advisor from Smart Growth America. Please introduce yourself and let us know your definition of walkability.
Thank you, Doug. And it was the Greenfield folks that I worked with, although I did a technical assistance for 3 days and a lot of follow-up with Fitchburg and know the good people there. I'm John Robert Smith, Senior Policy Advisor to Smart Growth America and Chairman of Transportation for America. And having been a mayor for 16 years, walkability is simply defined for me as no matter the neighborhood you live in your downtown, or your city, and no matter who you are, regardless of your race, your income, your physical ability, or your age, you can easily access the daily needs of life without dependence on a personal automobile. And walkability is a dynamite economic development strategy. Good to be with you.
Thank you, John Robert. I'm glad you're here too. Jeff Speck. Jeff is a principal with Speck and Associates and a leading authority and just a nationally known person about walkability, all things transit, all things pedestrian oriented. Jeff, welcome. We're really excited you're here as well. Give a little bit of an intro and your definition of walkability.
Thank you, Doug. So yeah, I'm a city planner. I have a national practice. I lecture internationally on walkability, and I'm based right here in Brookline, Massachusetts. So, you know, I grew up in Belmont, and I brought my family back here about 7 years ago because this was the best place we thought we could live in the world. And I've made a career out of defining walkability, so there's a lot of pressure on me these first few seconds. I like to say, you know, that echoing what Robert said a little bit, that you know, a walkable place is a place in which the automobile is an instrument of freedom and not a prosthetic device that we need to live our everyday lives. So that sort of freedom from absolute dependence on the automobile. I think walkability means different things in other places where actually we're less car dependent. But in the United States, where the car is such an important part of our lives, for better or worse, a reasonable definition of walkability is simply that we can live with fewer of them, and that the idea of living your life without one is possible to everyone. And I have to say, Robin, that I was just blown away by, you know, someone who writes about this and is now still writing about it. I was absolutely blown away by your statement about walkability, and I would hope that I can get that in writing, because I'd like to use it in my next whatever I write. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, we are ready and on time. This is great. So first session is going to be Stacy Vitell. She's going to deliver some remarks about walkability and the COVID-19 pandemic in Massachusetts to get us started. Stacy, take it away.
Thanks so much, Doug. So I'm going to try to keep my comments to speaking a little bit about COVID, but trying not to focus on it too much, and try to think about kind of what are some of the legacy implications that we can all learn from what we've all been through in the past 18 months. Before I start, I think it's important to start by describing some common characteristics of what I think of as walkable neighborhoods. You can go to the next slide. So first and foremost, they're people-focused places. Ideally, they have connected, smooth sidewalks, highly visible crosswalks, slow-moving traffic, and many places to stop, rest on a bench, and talk to a friend. They have pedestrian scale elements like trees and benches and lights that meet the needs of people walking. And buildings meet the street and front doors open onto sidewalks. Can you go to the next slide? They're community places filled with vibrancy of daily life, and much of that vibrancy comes from the destinations that are found in those neighborhoods. It's the local barber shop, the corner store that's open at all hours, the community medical center that provides urgent care. It is these thriving local places that are really key to creating and maintaining walkable communities. Next slide, please. At Walk Boston, where I work, we think of walkability as having 5 main elements: connections, destinations, safety, comfort, and activity. These elements depend on the quality and design of the infrastructure. Can you go to the next slide? And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about roadways and sidewalks, crossings, and streetscape elements. But successful walkable places also foster a sense of belonging, a sense of community connection. And I think it has been this sense of community identity that has contributed to the resilience and survival in this time of crisis. Can you go to the next slide, please? That's why walkability is essential to community recovery and resilience. During the height of COVID-19 pandemic, walking provided a way to cope with the social isolation and mental stress of being cooped up inside our homes. It provided a way to get physical exercise when sports teams couldn't compete and gyms were closed. We came up with new reasons to walk and new routes to take, finding hidden spaces and walking along streets that were nearby but never explored before. Next slide, please. And more people were out walking. These are maps that compare pre-COVID walking patterns, so January of 2020 and April of 22, so just when the COVID pandemic was beginning and we were in shutdown conditions. Those places that saw, you can see that in almost every municipality in Massachusetts, more people were walking. Those places that saw decreases in walking were the places where major job centers were closed, or those towns like Amherst or Williamstown way out west, where college students were sent home to try to stop the spread. It also made us quickly realize that there's not enough space for people to walk. Can you go to the next slide? Particularly when we were still learning about this virus and were told to stay masked 6 feet apart, even when we were outdoors. With so many people staying home and off the streets, the vast expanses of empty pavement dedicated to cars sat tantalizingly in front of us, waiting to be transformed into people-centered places where we could safely be outside. For us advocates, this was a no-brainer. We had been trying to reallocate space back to people and bikes and transit for years. Next slide, please. But before I talk more about how cities and towns in Massachusetts responded to the call for more sidewalk space, I want to acknowledge that what I just described was my COVID experience. Mine, as a white woman of privilege with a house and an office job. This was not and is not everyone's experience. A recent study published by MIT researchers found that people in higher income areas walked more during the pandemic, while people in lower income areas, including neighborhoods with more BIPOC communities and those suffering from long-term illnesses, did not. The shift in more people walking brings about important questions and realities for BIPOC communities, but Black communities in particular, whose walking experience is not the same as for white people or non-Black people of color. Ahmaud Arbery was out for a run and killed by a white mob because he was in a space where they thought he didn't belong. Amy Cooper called the police on a Black bird watcher in Central Park after he told her to put her dog on a leash. So while more people are out walking and using public space, some people continue to choose not to walk, not because they don't want to, but because racism and racial profiling has made it unsafe for them to do so. Next slide, please. The burden of traffic violence is also disproportionately felt in Black communities. Blacks make up 20% of pedestrian deaths nationwide, but only 12% of the population. Sidewalks in majority Black neighborhoods are 38 times more likely to be of poor quality. And Blacks and Latinos are 2 times more likely to be killed while walking than whites. Next slide, please. Data recently compiled by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health shows that Black pedestrians in Massachusetts are more than 2 times as likely to be hospitalized for their injuries compared to white people walking. And Black people walking are 4 times more likely to visit emergency department than white people. The racial justice movement, reignited with the killing of George Floyd by law enforcement, forced all of us to question how we define safety and belonging, 2 of those key elements that I discussed about my definition in walkable neighborhoods. So we need to continue to ask this question, walkable for who? And I would encourage everyone to read We Can't Walk If We Can't Breathe blog post that was written by Lawrence Brown. Next slide, please. Around the world, people were talking about new ways to use streets and public spaces. In Massachusetts, cities and towns, state agencies, private foundations, and neighborhood leaders responded to the changing COVID reality of less car traffic, the desire to walk and bike, and the need to provide restaurants and other businesses with outdoor dining opportunities. Next slide, please. While many cities and towns found a way to do this on their own, the Massachusetts Department of Transportation launched a program called the Shared Streets and Spaces Program. It was and continues to be a grant-based program for municipalities that allowed them to quickly respond to the many mobility challenges that were highlighted during the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you on this call applied for and received those funds. Some of the things that were funded were the need for more sidewalk space to walk safely 6 feet apart, to dine outdoors in unused parking lanes, and to reimagine streets as low-speed, safe spaces for people walking and biking. The popularity of this program demonstrated the desire, need, and capabilities of municipalities to implement quick build projects to make streets safer and more enjoyable for all. Next slide, please. The Shared Streets and Spaces program has awarded $33 million to 183 cities and towns in Massachusetts. Once again, they will be accepting applications in January of 2022, with a new emphasis on street safety due to the continued high rates of speeding that we're experiencing since the beginning of the pandemic. I'd like to just take a minute to talk about that. Next slide, please. And this increase in speeding during COVID. According to the Governor's Highway Safety Association, during 2020, when much of the country was under shelter-in-place restrictions due to COVID, the rate of overall traffic fatalities jumped 20% from 2019. So said another way, with a reduction, 16.5% reduction in vehicle miles traveled, that's VMT, nationwide, the rate of drivers striking and killing pedestrians jumped to 2.2 deaths per VMT, which is an increase from 1.8 deaths in 2019. So what was going on? What are some of these potential causes? Well, people point to speeding, distracted driving, and impaired driving. And we know that with fewer drivers on the road, there was more space to speed. Here in Massachusetts, next slide, please. MassDOT and others recognized this trend and began a communications campaign to remind people that times have changed, but speed limits haven't. Given the ongoing issues with racial profiling and traffic stops, many of us boosted our efforts to talk to legislators to pass an equitable automated enforcement law that would allow municipalities to install red light and speed cameras in high crash corridors, and making sure that we had a robust community engagement plan that went along with that policy. We're still working on that, and hopefully, and there's going to be a hearing next week, and so we're hopeful that the legislature will actually entertain the idea. So where are we now? What can we learn from all that's happened with walkability during this unprecedented time? Next slide, please. What might the legacy be for walkability? Well, focusing on the positive, we learned that if you give municipalities money and technical assistance and simplify permitting and facilitate change, we can make changes to streets faster than anyone imagined. When we're thinking about speeding, we know that traffic enforcement using police officers is fraught and disproportionately jeopardizes the lives of Black people. And once again, we're exploring ideas of ways to implement equitable automated enforcement programs and really thinking more about transferring those traffic enforcement duties to unarmed people or authorities. And finally, something that I know as an organization we've been thinking much about, and I have as an individual, is really what is that walkability definition? What do walkabilities mean? Who is welcome in walkable communities? And what does safety mean? Safety means different things to different people. And at Walk Boston, and personally, that's something that we're continuing to expand, is thinking about the definition of walkability as a more inclusive term. With that, I will end my comments and take some questions or turn it back to Doug.
Stacy, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. As we transition to John Robert, there are a couple questions that come up. You spoke about racial, some of the racial disparities in terms of walkability. Can you comment a little bit about the gender, issues in terms of walkability as well? Specifically, are there strategies that can provide a safer environment for women, girls who are walking? Fear of safety, fear of personal safety. Are there micro or macro strategies that can be followed as well to sort of address the gender issue in terms of walkability?
I can think about some infrastructure fixes that would, assist in addressing those issues, not only for women, of course, but for all. But thinking about ensuring that there's more lighting, ensuring that there's opportunities for creating environments where more people are out and about. So thinking about creating those lively destinations or vibrant town centers where there are more people. I don't have a specific strategy related to gender, but it's a great question and one that we should continue to explore.
Yeah, that was from the audience too. So thank you. And just one piece of curiosity: the maps you showed about walkability across the state and the patterns there. How was that data collected? How was that actually developed? Fascinating maps.
So I sent a link actually. And I can put that in the chat for people, but it's called the Mass Mobility Dashboard. It's put together by the state, and you can look at any number of different transportation related topics. So you can look at walking, biking, transit use, and many other, I think it was just put in the chat now. So many other, much more information kind of about how different things, you can turn on and off maps and make all sorts of different comparisons, but it's really informative in terms of looking at the patterns of transportation across Massachusetts.
Yeah, it's the first time I had seen that sort of comparison side by side. So very, very interesting. All right, well, thank you. And you'll be back later when we talk about, we have a session at the end. So John Robert is up next. Thank you, Stacy. John Robert is up next. John is going to talk about walkability and sort of the imperatives around why it's important from an economic development perspective, from a public health perspective, and all the good things that come about from implementing walkability strategies in your community. So, John Robert, take it away.
Thank you, Doug. And as I said, having been a mayor for so many years, this has to be something that's real and genuine. It has to be something that you not only do, you live through it, and you hopefully have proven success from it. So I do want to focus my comments on walkability as an economic and generational driver, especially post-COVID. Next slide. So let's put a little historic light on walkability. Think about it. Ever since there has been civilization, whether you're looking at the street grid of ancient Pompeii or an Aztec city, or a downtown in an older city in this country, they were all built the same way. There was a grid pattern that easily connected the different uses within a mixed use block of housing, retail, office space. There were different scales of structures within those blocks. And we did it for a reason, because we walked from our front door to the corner market. We walked from our front door to the place where we worked, or we walked to the nearest streetcar and took that streetcar to an office or a job, or to the train station that then connected us to the rest of the larger region. That's how we grew this country, city by city, town by town, in urban areas, in rural areas alike. Then came the 1950s and our heavy investment in the interstate highway system, which has had many benefits, but here's where we've ended up today. We have sidewalks that were totally neglected We placed poles and other obstructions in a narrow sidewalk, so it's really not usable anymore. And in fact, some sidewalks don't even connect one to the other. I like to think the city got the sidewalk in the right place in this lower photo, and it was the county that misaligned theirs. But there's a disconnection. And we built a snarl of roadways, interstates, highways that divide our neighborhoods as effectively as any river or mountain could. And what we were left with were hollowed out downtowns and dead retail businesses. Next slide. And it changed how we do everything, even the simplest tasks such as walking the dog. Now imagine the body mass index of this gentleman who won't even get out of his car and walk the dog if he had a sidewalk to do so. But things are changing. Next slide. Things are changing, and they're changing rapidly. They're changing demographically and economically, and we must understand the shift, especially post-COVID. Next slide. So let's start with what was the largest generation in the country, us boomers. We don't want to fight the interstate highway system anymore. It intimidates us now. We also know we're going to live longer, so we're exercising more so that those added years are healthy years and productive years. And we're choosing to leave the large single family, large lot home. Simply, we don't want to spend the few hours we have left on this planet mowing the lawn. So we're living downtown and in apartments and in very walkable places. And the truth is, you don't want us on the interstate highway system for the next 20 years. So invest in walkability and get us out of the way in front of you. Now, the generation that has topped us and is now the largest is the Millennial Generation. And yes, they're different, but when I say millennials, I'm not talking about some strange group of young people who live in Portland, Oregon. I'm talking about your children and your grandchildren. And if you say, I want to build a hometown where my children and our children can come home and find a meaningful life, then you better ask them what they're looking for. And they're looking for different things. They're moving to the place they want to be and then finding the job. Next slide. And their choices in transportation are different than ours when we were their age. Yes, they will drive, but they're taking more and more public transportation. The largest ridership increase for Amtrak is in the youth market. They also walk more and bike more. They're a more physically active generation in their transportation choices than any we've ever seen in our lifetime. Next slide. And it impacts where they choose to live. Only 12% want to live in the cul-de-sac neighborhoods that they may have grown up in. Yes, 47% want to live in a big metropolitan area, but look, 40% want to live in small towns, in rural places, provided they have the critical broadband access that is absolutely necessary today, and that downtown, regardless of how small, has a sense of itself and a little pop to it after 5 o'clock. Next slide. And our economy has changed fundamentally. We moved first from the agricultural economy to a manufacturing economy, but now we've moved to a knowledge economy. And if you're an economic developer or you employ one, if they're still chasing smokestacks instead of chasing talent, then you're going to be on the losing end of that economic development spectrum. Next slide. So we knew that a large number of businesses, manufacturing, research facilities, home headquarters had moved from a suburban location into a downtown. We thought we knew why, but we called and asked all 500 of those that had moved in a 5-year period why they chose to go to the downtown. And to a company, they said, we're seeking the bright young workforce of the future, and they simply won't come to where we're located. So we're going to go to where they want to be. And those places were walkable. You can see the walk score, and you can put in your address on walkscore.com and see how walkable your home address, your business address is. We're looking for a walkable place, a bikeable place, and a place that had a transit connection that fit the scale of the community in which they live. Next slide. And the good news is, yes, you can expect this to occur in a place like Indianapolis or Newark or Cleveland, but it also worked in Conway, Arkansas. Little Conway drew 3 tech firms, and all 3 site selectors said, we can hire the kind of people we want to move to Conway because it's got a cool downtown. Next slide. So why does all of this matter, especially post-COVID? Well, one thing we've learned is with COVID, we can work almost anywhere with most of the jobs that are developing now for the next 50 years. And communities are in a ferocious competition over the creation of a sense of place, whether they know it or not. Next slide. So don't be fooled by what a sense of place is. Some experts will tell you, well, you need a sidewalk, you need a little tree canopy, that gives you a sense of place. Well, look at Larpenteur Avenue on the left side of your screen there. Yes, there's a sidewalk. Yes, there are a few trees, but why in the world would you ever want to walk there? Now look at the image on the right side of your screen. Yes, sidewalks, tree canopies, businesses close to those sidewalks. That street, you will stop and you will dine on that street. You will shop on that street. You will live on that street. You can fall in love on that street. Next slide. So questions that every town ought to think about, and you should know as a leader in a city, what is driving economic development today, not yesterday? Where do you make your money as a government? And then where should you put your money as a government or a leader to get the best impact for that investment? Next slide. So we talk about these things as walkability and return on investment, whether you're looking at the public side of the ledger or the private side of the ledger. Walkability investment has a return. Next slide. So for the public sector, obviously, the greater land value means there will be a higher percentage of tax paid on that land that is more valuable, and it boosts retail sales. So you have the opportunity to grow your retail sales tax revenue. Obviously, more business activity leads to higher levels of employment, which increases income back into your community if you have wage tax revenue. And then there are certainly other business taxes that also rise with a rising property value. For the private sector, you can earn higher rents if you own property in a walkable place. Again, your sales increase, there's a higher retail value, and we're seeing retail come back in walkable downtowns, and especially in smaller places. Offices want to locate there because there's more activity, and again, the young worker wants to be there. And then, of course, rising home values are good for the private property owner. Next slide. So we do at Smart Growth America what we call a hotspot analysis, and think of it in simple terms. If you have one high value piece of property, you can leverage the property value of surrounding properties. And the more of those high value properties you have clustered together rather than spread apart, the greater the impact on the whole. So a hotspot is where high value properties are clustered, and a cold spot, unfortunately, is where low value properties are clustered. Next slide. So we did this hotspot analysis for Fitchburg, Massachusetts. The hot spots are red, the cold spots are blue. take a look at what's hot. Your downtown's hot, your medical campus, your commercial areas, all in and around the downtown. And what are the cold spots? The further away you get from that hot spot to city center, the colder the spots are. Now, the good thing about a hot spot, it has the opportunity to raise the value of cold spots near to it if you invest in those places. And you may say, well, those residential areas, you know, those are some pricey homes spread out from that hot spot. Next slide. But when you look at the land value in Fitchburg, 6% of Fitchburg's land area is in a hot spot, but 35% of the city's land value is in the hot spot. Next slide. And when you compare the per acre value of the hot spot in Fitchburg versus the cold spot in Fitchburg, you'll see that a hot spot property in Fitchburg is roughly 1.1 million per acre in value. And a cold spot, the rest of Fitchburg, is $169,000 per acre. So if you're a local government and you have limited assets, or you're a developer and you want to invest your money where you get the best ROI for that investment, it's focusing on those hot spots. And every one of these we've ever done, the downtown is the hot spot. Thank you. Be glad to take questions.
Thank you, John. Yeah, John Robert, thank you so much. Your presentation resonates with me. I'm an economic development guy, and you really do make the case. I want to underscore a couple of things. You know, in terms of the economy in Massachusetts, that you had touched on it. I think in the Arkansas example. You know, the life sciences industry here, one of, if not the first, maybe the second highest criteria for site selection is quality of life, quality of place, because for the reasons you said, that people want to be located in places where they can live, work, and play. And I think, you know, the hotspots you show, if you overlay the transit map of at least the Eastern Massachusetts region, you might see a correlation there. But walkability strategies for economic development are not just for transit-oriented communities. There's a lot of folks on this call, on this seminar here in Central Mass, and places like Pepperell, or, you know, North Andover, North Adams, right? So these are really interesting concepts, and you really do make the case. And by the way, I'm at the tail end of the baby boom, and I have a 16-year-old, so I'm more afraid of him driving than other folks driving right now. But I understand your point. A couple of the questions for you here. You were mayor of Meridian, Mississippi. What, you know, your experience there promoting walkability? How did you fund investments in walkability there? And did you see the type of return on investment that you were just describing in your community?
Thank you for the question, Doug. And yes, absolutely saw the return on investment. So when I was elected mayor, the business community said, abandon the downtown. Downtown's dead. Don't put any money in the downtown. And you will see later a picture of a Grand Opera House we restored. They wanted that demolished and a service parking lot built in its place, because maybe that would bring back a little of the downtown. Well, that wasn't where I intended us to head, and it certainly wasn't a vision I saw that I could share with my children or grandchildren. So our first investment was to build the South's first multimodal transportation center. That's a big word for bringing passenger rail, intercity bus, local transit, access out to the airport, all together in one place in the downtown, simply based on the theory that if I have all of those people moving in and around that facility in the downtown, maybe they'll buy a meal at a restaurant. You know, maybe they'll shop at one of the stores downtown. Maybe they'll even one day get an apartment in the downtown, because of course I was told no one would ever live in the downtown again. And of course, what we've seen is for every dollar invested in that transportation center by the city, it's leveraged $165,000 in additional private sector investment within 3 or 4 block area. So there are now people
Mhm.
living in the downtown in apartments and condominiums. There's life after 5. So very much a return on investment. And you mentioned smaller places. Look no further than Irwin, Tennessee. It's up in the mountains, beautiful area, very small place in a valley between mountains, not easy to get to. They don't have local transit, but they now have walkability. We worked with them. They cannot build enough housing in the downtown to accommodate the demand there now. So it works.
That's fascinating. Again, before we switch over to Delegate Lewis, quickly on the economic development strategies, promoting more development, how is displacement, how is gentrification addressed in some of these strategies? I assume you got to keep an eye on that too. So
Well,
did you think about that in some of your strategies?
yes, and but you have to think about it ahead of the investment. If you wait to think about it after you've made the improvements in the investment, it's gotten away from you. The gentrification is taken over. I live in Washington, D.C. on 8th Street. They didn't start thinking about displacement until after they built the streetcar line. And of course, what's happened is now the property values are so high, the residents who once lived there and the shop owners who once were very successful there can no longer be there. So Meridian is 65% African American. So and I live right downtown in a very, very mixed neighborhood. We started with investment in those neighborhoods. So how do we make it safer? How do we make it more resilient? How do we deal with the specific topographical areas there of ditches and drainage? So let's show that we can do it here. And the big change was in how the neighbors felt about their government. They actually decided, it matters what City Hall is doing because I now have a stake in it and they're hearing me and listening to me. And if you don't listen, go to a neighborhood, listen to their needs and respond to it, then you're not going to be able to address any future gentrification. And I've achieved nothing if I drive my people out of their home neighborhood. I don't care the value of the neighborhood. I drive them out. What kind of mayor have I been?
We need to find a city for you up here to run for mayor. Okay, so let's look for that. Okay, thank you for your remarks. It's a perfect segue into Delegate Lewis here, who was going to speak to her experiences in Baltimore and some of these same challenges at that level. So we're really excited to have you here, Delegate Lewis. Thank you so much for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you, Doug. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. And thank you in advance for listening to me rant a little bit about how awesome Baltimore City is and how much work we have to do. What I hope to do in my remarks here in the next few minutes is to find common potential lessons that we can share from Baltimore City that may apply to some of your settings in Massachusetts. In particular, I'll be addressing myself to elected officials, those of you in the audience today who have the power, more power than you know, to set the trajectory for walkability and ultimately human rights and social justice in the places where you serve. So, and I'd like to have the next slide, please. So, I'm going to talk over some images here that will give you a little bit of visual context about Baltimore, but I'll do a quick introduction, share some context, identify, the obstacles to walkability, suggest some solutions, again, directed towards elected officials, and talk about some constraints and where we're going next with walkability in the great city of Baltimore. So it's worth me saying that I'm the only car-free legislator in the entire Maryland General Assembly. That's our state legislature. There are 141 members of the Maryland General Assembly. I'm the only one who chooses to live without owning a car. And let me tell you, in Baltimore City, which is although it's a great mid-Atlantic historic East Coast city, that was the home of one of the greatest streetcar networks in North America, 600 linear miles of streetcar line in the city at its height. Despite that history, we now have one of the least, let me put it this way, the most disinvested transit systems in the country. So living without a car in a great historic city like this, it's actually incredibly difficult. I walk, I ride my bike, I depend on transit, and unfortunately, I also have to depend on rideshare, but I do that as little as I can. I think I also mentioned that we are a part-time citizen legislature, which means that there are great constraints on my time and my resources as a policymaker. Part-time citizen legislature means that, I have a part-time staff. I don't have access to lots of, levers of authority to move resources by myself. So the changes, the suggestions and changes I'm going to put before you, they're in that context of definite scarcity. So context, Baltimore City was founded in 1792. It's a little bit younger than Boston, but not much. So the city is about 292 years old. There are about 550,000 residents. We lost population in the last census. But I'll also mention that the city is 60% Black. It's the Blackest municipality in the state of Maryland. I'll also mention that I'm the first African American ever elected in the whitest district in the Blackest city in Maryland. That has its own set of dynamics, opportunities, and constraints as well. But Baltimore was the home of Frederick Douglass, Billie Holiday, Edgar Allan Poe, H.L. Mencken. Baltimore is the home of the state's great universities. Johns Hopkins, some of you out there may know Hopkins. It is, we like to think of Harvard as the Hopkins of the Northeast. But we've got University of Maryland, all the great medical systems right here in this city. Number 3 ranked nationally ranked art school, the Maryland College of Art is right here. Great museums, the zoo, the National Aquarium, all here. And yet, Baltimore City is also incredibly deeply disinvested and is suffering even today from the history of deliberate, harmful racial segregation. Baltimore is the home of residential racial segregation policies. So we are so good at isolating and dehumanizing Black people in this city that the residential segregation policy framework that was invented here was adopted by the Federal Housing Administration and is the basis for nationwide residential redlining, which, as you all know, is incredibly harmful and destructive. We are the beneficiaries of that, brilliant, hateful policy here. That means that we have neighborhoods that are entirely disinvested and others that are incredibly rich. Some of you may know Professor Lawrence Brown. I think he was mentioned earlier. He coined the term the white L, which describes a geographic L shape running down the middle of the city where concentration of predominantly white communities and where most of the investment is located. So we're struggling with all of those things. I'll also just mention, because some of what I'll tell you later won't make sense unless you know this about Baltimore. Baltimore's police department is an agency of the state. That's a vestige of Civil War era decisions related to, the Confederacy. So the state controls our police department. That will change, but for now, it's been that way 100 years. The state controls Baltimore City's transit agency. So we don't run our own buses or trains, they're run by the state. And yet 30% of Baltimore households do not have access to a personally owned vehicle. 30% of the people of Baltimore City depend on mass transit, which has been grossly underinvested. 30,000 kids ride our city buses to get to school. We don't have yellow school buses. We depend so much on the state. We also suffer from the depredations of an anti-transit governor who not only has underfunded statewide transit needs during his 2 terms in office, he is famous for having canceled the Red Line Light Rail project. This was a transit, one of the biggest transit investment initiatives in the country about 10 years ago, when it was approved for FTA financing to the tune of about $1 billion. This governor, the anti-transit governor, canceled the project, leading to a Title VI complaint filed by the ACU and the NAACP-LDF, which was thrown out when the last guy, the former guy, became president in 2016. So there are lots of historic decisions, policies, more recent decisions, and cultural factors that leave Baltimore City in this weird place of having incredible assets and history and incredible devastation in our infrastructure. I mentioned transit, but you all know transit's closely associated with decisions about land use, obviously, and land use is about decisions whether you prioritize cars over people, and we've very much prioritized cars over people here. People who are most harmed by all of that history and all of these anti-human decisions really are Black people and poor people in Baltimore City. That increasingly includes immigrants. And here, most of our immigrant families are from Central and South America. So that's the background, that's the context. What do you do in a city with the weight of history lined up against walkability? If you wanted to write a recipe for the least walkable city, you do all the things Baltimore has done or been subject to. As the only car-free legislator, you see me in that photograph on the left waiting for the bus. I am like hands-on experiencing the challenges of a non-walkable city, mobility disinvested city. And I, as a public health professional, someone trained in public health and has worked all over the world and experienced great walkability in other places, I feel really, I've been long compelled to change this dynamic. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about, that's context. The problem is the lack of human-centered public space. You see a photo of me there waiting for the bus. In the center of the slide, you'll see an image of a mom and her child trying to cross the street, a 4-lane, essentially highway, slicing through a densely populated historic neighborhood. In fact, my own neighborhood. I live about 2 blocks from where this photo was taken. Streets are designed to move cars fast to the detriment of human beings. And in the upper right, you'll see another photo of folks trying to cross, I think, a 4 or 6-lane road in a residential neighborhood to reach a bus stop. The problem is this arrangement is unsustainable, inhumane, leads to high rates of pedestrian injury. Solution, it's not so simple. There are some statewide policies that need to change, like we're returning control of the police department to Baltimore City. But also in terms of how we invest in infrastructure, the land use decisions we make to center human needs, for mobility. There are other decisions that need to happen, but they won't happen unless people demand the changes. So that's the problem, inhospitable public space. The solution involves 2 parts. First, legislative leadership, and secondly, grassroots organizing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I have done in my very small way to help address the problem of an inhospitable public domain. And here's what we did. So walkability really is a political issue because it's a human rights issue. Post George Floyd, post COVID, everyone understands that walkability is a racial equity issue. And so what do? terms of legislative leadership, I encourage all of the folks in the audience who are in elected positions, who are lawmakers in particular, who have the power to change the way funding decisions are made, change the laws, put more money into human-centered land use decisions. That means pedestrian-centered, walkable, transit-oriented, bike-oriented, non-car options. We all know what they are. I don't need to go into it. But do your part. As a legislative leader on the issue of mobility and transit, I've introduced and passed a few bills. In the legislature, we've done quite a lot as a group of progressive Democrats. We passed a bill last year to require the governor to fund the transit system. He vetoed it. We're going to override him. He needn't worry. We will override, and we will get money for transit so that we're ready for the federal funds that will come through the Biden administration. I introduced legislation to require more efficient enforcement of dedicated bus lanes. Baltimore City is the only jurisdiction in the state with dedicated bus lanes, 5 or 6 miles right now, but they don't work because they're constantly interfered with, blocked, etc. We need better enforcement. I introduced legislation, and God willing, inshallah, we'll pass it this coming year. Complete streets. Baltimore City is the only jurisdiction in the state with a complete streets program, but there's no money for it. So I introduced a bill that requires all revenues from traffic enforcement, red light cameras, speed cameras, etc. All the citation revenue that goes in will be directly applied to fund complete streets, infrastructure, retrofits, etc. And then I'll just mention that, as we know, pedestrian injury and death is very much a racial disparity in this country. I introduced legislation that requires the state of Maryland to start measuring race and ethnicity in non-fatal vehicle crashes, because I literally have, like, nobody knows how many Black and brown people are injured or killed injured in non-fatal crashes in the state every year. We already know from nationwide data mentioned by Walk Boston in the earlier presentation. We know that Black and brown and Native American people are more likely to be hit and killed. But in Maryland, we can't tell you how many, so we can't make the decisions that we have to change. That will change. My bill passed, and we'll get a report, and we'll work on that. I want to talk next about the grassroots organizing that's required to move more human-centered land use, more walkable space. And really, in a place like Baltimore, where we have the weight of history so heavy, everything's designed to harm Black, brown, and poor people, and to isolate them and prevent them from moving around. There's a concept introduced, I think also by Professor Lawrence Brown, that talks about mobility justice, and very much a problem here. But if people are so bound up, constrained, and disempowered to change their environments, they've got to be activated and mobilized. How do you do that with all this weight of history? I focused on my own community, where I was hearing a lot of complaints about pedestrian injury. And if we'll go to the next slide, the complaints were coming from, whoops, I think there's another, there we go. The complaints were coming from all kinds of folks in my immediate community, college-educated, white progressives who like to ride bikes and really concerned about the lack of protected bike infrastructure, from working class African Americans, legacy residents who've been in the area for a long time and who are tired of running for their lives across the street to go to the grocery store. I heard from families whose children riding their bikes have been hit by cars on their residential street. I heard from neighbors whose little row houses, an example of which you can see in the photo in the lower right, we call them row houses here, whose little row houses have been repeatedly smashed by racing cars, thrusting through the air and bashing into their steps and front doors. Happens so frequently in my community. People are sick of it. But who do these disparate communities, what are they? They don't necessarily think they have anything in common. White and even, Black gentrifiers like myself may not necessarily immediately see commonality with working class legacy residents. We all have the same problem though. So after listening to lots of concerns and some very loud complaints, I decided the best solution was Grassroots Organizing 101, bring people together around the table to talk about opportunities to make change. We established a little network called the Livable Streets Coalition. It includes 7 neighborhoods. It includes organizations like the National Federation of the Blind, Disability Rights Group, the AARP, Americans, my brain just froze, AARP, you guys know what that acronym means, as well as the Baltimore City Department of Transportation, all partners joining together around the table to talk about how we leverage existing city policy on complete streets, for example, to change the dynamics on our streets to center people. Coalition has met several times over the last 2 years. 2020 was tough with COVID. We had to meet over Zoom, and that made it impossible for many folks on the other side of the digital divide to participate. We did our best. We did some public flyering and did our best. But in any case, we got input from residents. I will mention, in starting the coalition, one of my first steps was to do a door-to-door survey of residents. And because a lot of folks said, working class Black people, they don't care about bike lanes, they don't care about walkability. So here's what my survey found. I knocked on 400 doors with some volunteers, talked to over 250 residents, and over 80% of them, mostly African-American older people, said to me, the best way to improve my street is to slow down these cars. Armed with that, vision, we have met. We conducted walking audits of the community to identify the danger zones and dangerous intersections where we should prioritize complete streets interventions, for example. But these are parts of the neighborhood that would never get them because Black and brown working class folks aren't tweeting at the city DOT, right? Install some flex posts, like it's not happening. So mobilize them, power them, increased knowledge about options, and build social bonds across the divides of race, income, history. And we have, as a result of the work of the coalition over the last almost 2 years, come up with a project that we are trying to put together that will do traffic calming in front of an elementary school and engage neighbors, paint a little crosswalk, put in some little flex posts, really low-hanging fruit interventions that the people will own and then see the connection between their desire, their action, and the government's response. I figure I'm close to the end. I want to share some constraints so that folks in elected office know this is not easy. Everything that I've been doing through the Livable Streets Coalition, I've been doing on my own as a part-time citizen legislator with a couple of volunteers. Very lucky to have an expert transportation planner seconded to us for a few months by AARP and their Aging in Place program, and some graduate students from the School of Public Health joining me, and neighbors, of course, giving their time so generously. All that we've done has really been on a shoestring and running mostly on my own willpower. We need an organization like a Walk Boston here in Baltimore. We need more support from our local transit agency, and need to pass some state legislation to make these kinds of initiatives easier, because I can only go so far running on fumes, right? So I'll just say that when it comes to walkability, just to wrap it up, there are policy and legislative strategies that have to be in place to move walkability where we need it. And there's also grassroots power that must be mobilized to get the policy change that's required. So it's not chicken or egg, it's egg and egg, or chicken and chicken. But I want my city to be ready for the federal dollars that will flow when it's time to start investing in human-centered mobility and walkability. And I hope I've given you some tips. Don't give up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Delegate Lewis. I have 1,000 questions, but thank you for sharing. And if you don't mind putting in the chat box, if you could share some more resource, your website for the Livable Streets Coalition or other resource information in the chat box, that'd be awesome.
I will.
And your challenge, I love the call to action, do your part. Let that resonate, because I think that applies to lots of things in this environment. And do your part is, I think, the mantra on this. I'm wondering if what we heard from John Robert Smith on the economic development imperatives on this, to help you in your arguments, certainly on the equity, social, racial equity imperatives as well. How does the economic development imperative play into your debates across the aisle in a bipartisan way to try to get some of these things done in the Maryland legislature? Just a few comments on that would be great before we turn it over to Jeff.
I think I'll just say that amazingly, I mean, it has shocked me. Transit is one of the only issues where we have such a low level of bipartisan engagement. The Maryland General Assembly now, thanks to the 2018 Blue Wave, we now have enough progressive legislators activated about transit and land use. We created a transit caucus, first time in history, that has like over 60 members, like almost more than half of the members are in the transit caucus. And there are Republican and Democratic members of that caucus, only a couple of Republicans, but it's hard for me to believe there aren't more. So really, I think the secret really is creating pathways, streams for communication from the grassroots about the need for transit investment, for walkability investment, because people want it. I knocked on 400 doors and I couldn't believe little old African-American ladies were telling me, slow down these cars. Like everyone said, only the white guys on one-gear bicycles care about that. No, everybody wants it. So the most important thing, it's not so much fighting about bipartisan agreement, but more about activating people to scream and yell, to tweet, to march, and demand that their elected officials deliver what the people actually want, which is more walkable streets, more pedestrian-centered space. Like, honest to God, that's and better transit. They're all connected.
Do your part. I love it. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so moving on to the next part of the agenda here with Jeff Speck. He's going to give us some practical best practices on walkability and some of the things that he's seen in his career and that might be employed here in Massachusetts. So Jeff, take it away.
Thanks, Doug. Wow, I mean, I participate in a lot of these events, and I don't think I've ever taken so many notes as I have so far today from the other speakers. So great panel. Hope we have some time for conversation. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully tell me if this doesn't look appropriate. I'm going to get into the technical aspects of it, particularly around street design. I just think it's amazing. 80% of the people that Delegate Lewis polled said the best way to improve my street is to slow down the cars. And I'll be talking a lot about how to make that happen, because in fact, unless you've got speed cameras everywhere, speed limits don't do it. So I've got about half an hour for this segment, including Q&A. This is an hour-long talk, but I'm going to give it in 20 to 25 minutes. And in fact, just to stay on point, Siri, set a timer for 22 minutes. And when this timer goes off, I'll know that I have only 3 minutes left at most to finish my talk. So let's start. I've reoriented my practice as a city planner around walkability. My best-selling book is called Walkable City, and in it I put forward what I call my general theory of walkability, which asks the question, in America, how do you get people to walk? And a number of us have come to the conclusion that to do that, you need to do 4 things simultaneously. The walk needs to be useful, it needs to be safe, it needs to be comfortable, and it needs to be interesting. And you can't just do 3 of these things. So that's the structure of of much of my research into making places more walkable, and also into the structure of my book, and it's the structure of my quick talk today. So we'll first start with the reason to walk, and that's a story I learned from my mentors, founders of the New Urbanism movement, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. And Andres used to give this talk called The Story of Planning, in which he discussed how people, were in the 18th century, the 19th century, were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and the planners moved the housing away from the factories, and lifespans increased immediately and dramatically, and the planners were hailed as heroes. And we like to say they've been trying to repeat that experience ever since. So the onset of Euclidean zoning, the separation of, segregation of land into large areas of single use. And it's no accident that, this image is all about segregation. I think we've only begun to discuss the tremendous degree, slowly dawning on some of us, that racism has shaped almost every aspect of the American built environment. But clearly when it comes to land use and walkability, when you zone and you have large areas of single use, you create a framework in which walkability is not possible. And the most walkable places, of course, and the most walked in places are those places where the zoning is the most confetti-like, the finest grain, the greatest mix of uses, everything close together. And that gets us into the fundamental new urbanist argument, which I love to share, which is that there's really only two ways that we've tested by the thousands to design communities. One is the traditional neighborhood, the other is suburban sprawl. The neighborhood is defined as being compact, mixed use, in other words, diverse in terms of use, and walkable. Sprawl is defined as clearly not being compact, often being single use in a single area. And then it's not walkable because if you can see my mouse, very few of the streets actually go anywhere. So those few that do connect vehicles have to take all the vehicles that are trying to get somewhere. And when they do that, they become what we call automotive sewers, oversized, a nuisance, and not something that you would face a house to, let alone walk along. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts, the places we only live, where we only work, where we only shop. Schools get bigger and bigger and further apart, with the parking lots bigger than the schools because no one is walking to them. And of course, when you separate everything from everything else and reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, what you get is a highway system that's, what people will look back at our civilization. This will be our pyramids, this amazing amount of concrete we've laid on the planet. I always tell people, for some, and we heard from Robert, maybe it's only 12% of the population, but for some people, this is still the American dream, the house isolated only with other houses. But people have to understand it's a two-part deal. You can't have one without the other, often to absurd extremes. And I showed this Massachusetts intersection all over the world to great gasps. The experience of inhabiting this landscape can be extraordinarily frustrating. It's taxing on families. The longer your commute, the more likely you are to get divorced. And of course, driving is no fun, and being a pedestrian can be even worse in this environment. This is a slide many of you have perhaps seen. I got it from an epidemiologist about 15 years ago. The idea that we've built an environment in which we drive to park, to take the escalator to the gym, to get on the treadmill, to walk, is why the doctors are telling us we have the most, the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents. And so when it comes to making new places, and we're making the equivalent of new cities every day in America, these are the two diagrams to consider. The remainder of my talk is about our existing communities, but as we build new places, it's important to understand which model are we adapting, or adopting? Are we adopting the sprawl model at the left or the traditional neighborhood model at the right? What distinguishes them? Well, it's all the same stuff, but basically how big is it? How far apart is it? How integrated is it? And do you have a street network that's many small blocks, which I'll talk about, or do you have this collector system of, this dendritic branching system in which every road goes on the collector, every trip goes on the collector. We now know how to build what's at the right again, and we've been doing it for a while now, and there's no reason to build any more of what we see on the left of this image. So when you look at existing communities, I've just randomly chosen Needham here, but it exhibits a lot of the same concerns that we have in communities that are much smaller or communities that are much larger. When you look at the downtown and you're in this first category of the useful walk, you ask the question, what is missing or underrepresented? Almost always it's housing, and there's almost no housing in this image. Similarly, Newton Center, I've done a lot of work in Newton, almost no housing in this image. And when you bring housing, more housing in large number to these downtown areas, you're giving people an incredible quality of life where all this stuff that they want to walk to and enjoy is right at their fingertips. And so the first step is bring more housing downtown. The second question is, which use in your downtown is underpriced and overrepresented? And that almost always is parking, and the classic issue of, well, there's parking here, but maybe we're so unwalkable or so unwilling to walk because of the environment around us that we feel like there's not enough parking. When you price parking properly, there is enough parking. So cities, maybe yours among them, have made plans that adjust the price of parking based on the desirability of parking. When you price any good, including parking, in a way that reflects its value, people make rational decisions in the marketplace, and your parking pricing needs to reflect that. Transit, of course, is the other huge part of this useful category, and I just wanted to show one quick project. I always say, you can have a perfectly walkable neighborhood without transit, but a walkable city relies on transit, because if you don't connect the walkable places to each other, then everyone who can afford to buy a car will buy a car, and then the landscape will continue to shape itself around their needs, which they're very vocal about, and become less and less walkable. This is the end of the Green Line, the Riverside branch in Newton. It's 1,000 cars waiting for people who do the park and ride. I just wanted to quickly show a project that was just approved in Newton for about 1 million square feet of shops and apartments and lab buildings located in this parking lot, which we've turned into a structure which we used to hide the rail yard, and then we hide the parking lot behind a nice inhabited building edge. We have a square, a transit square that includes shops below residential. We have a residential main street. We have a tech square or a lab square at the end, at the other end, housing everywhere and lab work happening here. This was fought by neighbors, and I was pleased to read this important article in the Boston Globe, some of you may have seen, that actually referred to the circumstance in Newton and said there was a lawn with 3 signs in it: right size Newton, right size Riverside, in other words, make it smaller and reduce its amount of housing, which included a lot of affordable housing. And the third side said Black Lives Matter. Point being that that's hypocritical. If you really want to find places for people, poor people, people of color, yourself as you get older, or perhaps your kids when they get out of school, you need to encourage more housing, particularly housing on transit, like this particular project at Riverside. Second category, the safe walk, is where I spend most of my time, because it is where we can make the most change the quickest in cities. It involves things that typically the city controls and can change right away, such as the striping of their streets, as we learned during COVID, when a lot of cities temporarily, or in some cases we hope permanently, made their streets more multimodal. Here is the key diagram. A car going 35 is 7 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25. So what are the factors of the landscape we can change to get people driving slower? The first is block size. Portland, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. Salt Lake City, famously unwalkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Here they are side by side, quite different. When you double the average block size, as in this study of 24 different California cities, you actually almost quadruple the number of non-highway fatal crashes. Here's downtown Boston, same scale, extremely small blocks compared to Portland. Here's Boston area. You get out of town and this is what you find, blocks that are almost, some of them larger than the page. Of course, this is the automotive area. It's just two different models. The next issue, if any of you have multi-lane one-way streets, not one-lane one-way streets, but multi-lane one-way streets, encourage speeding, mostly because of the opportunity to jockey and the fact it feels like a highway. In Louisville, Kentucky, Brook, First, Second, and Third are all one way. They converted First and Brook to two-way. And when they did so, car crashes dropped by about half. Crime actually even dropped by about a quarter. The one-ways crashes went up. Crime went up. We see this in city after city. I've worked on plans for maybe a dozen cities where we've turned one-way streets like this one in Lowell back into two-way streets. This is the plan that was implemented for downtown Lowell. The green streets were all converted back to two-way traffic. I'm sorry it was raining on the day I was there, so it's not a pretty picture, but the street is much calmer, much less like a highway, and the stores have more people in them thanks to the calmer traffic. If any of you have 4-lane streets, the classic 4-lane to 3-lane road diet remarkably saves lives without reducing the travel, the throughput of the road. So of course the injuries drop when you do this, but here are 23 different examples of 4 to 3-lane road diets in which the volume of traffic has not dropped because 4-lane streets are incredibly inefficient. And they're everywhere in New England. We have them in Randolph, we have them in Newton. Here's a proposal actually for Washington Street in Newton, which we hope will eventually be implemented, turning it from a 4-lane street to a 3-lane street, also taking a park that's against the highway and putting it against the neighborhood. The width of the lanes themselves, Andres Duany used to show this slide and say, the typical road to the typical subdivision in the United States is now wide enough to allow you to observe the curvature of the earth. And it's true because the standards have changed. Here's the 60s, here's the 80s, same height of airplane, same size of house, but notice what's happened to the streets. There's been this mission creep as the streets get wider and wider. What happens on wider streets? People drive faster. Here's the Boston version I found. But we all know that people respond to their environment in that way. Wider lanes equals faster travel. And lanes used to be in urban areas. Now in residential areas, they can be quite narrower, but in urban areas where there's a lot of traffic, they used to be 10 feet. Thanks to NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials, they can be 10 feet again. Many cities have streets that are 11, 12, that have lanes that are 11, 12, 13 feet wide. Newbury Street in Boston, it's a 2-lane one-way. Why don't people speed on it? Well, one reason is that the lanes are effectively 10 feet wide or a little bit less, thanks to the 34-foot width of that street. But Boston itself is full of many streets which have more room than they need. Causeway Street has about 8 more feet in it than the number of lanes would suggest if they were 10 feet wide. Congress Street has about 8 more feet in it than the number of lanes would suggest if they were 10 feet wide. And so we find this 8 feet all over Boston, and we can use it for something else, like how about bikes? So another huge part of the safety discussion is the design of our bike infrastructure. Bicycling, is the biggest revolution currently underway in only some American cities. The question is, if like Portland, here pictured, you invest in it or not. Bicycle population follows bicycle investment, period. And particularly if you want a wide variety of people cycling, you need to invest in protected cycle lanes. In this case, where the parked cars have been pulled off the curb to create a barrier that protects the bike lane from moving vehicles. Here's one, Prospect Park West in New York City. 3-laner becomes a 2-laner, the bike lane is protected. Of course, the number of cyclists triples, speeding drops precipitously, injury crashes are down, but remarkably, the street handles just as much traffic as before because people were basically speeding from red light to red light before. This being New York, there was a 5-year drawn-out lawsuit. Eventually, the bike-hating NIMBY trolls grudgingly surrendered to reality, but I showed this slide to contrast this image with this image and the idea of a protected versus an unprotected bike lane. No one wants their daughter in the door zone, and these door zones fill up with stuff. When you leave a bike lane unprotected, people put things in it, and that's another reason why we need to protect our lanes. Our cities are full of sharrows, like in Quincy. Recent research, actually not that recent anymore, 2016, demonstrated that sharrows actually make streets more dangerous. You're better off without them. When I learned of this, I took to Twitter and asked my followers to come up with a new sharrow symbol, and there were some really good suggestions, but the winner was this one, the prairie. Please don't hit me in the bike lane. We need protected bike lanes, not sharrows. Parked cars, parallel parking, a barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. More important than you think. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. You'll notice you can park on one side of the street and not the other. Here is dining on the park side of the street. Here is dining on the unparked side of the street. Then my favorite restaurant in North Adams doesn't feel safe in front because of the absence of parallel parking in that street, which has room to hold it. Of course, the other part of this picture is street trees. Street trees also, contrary to what the engineers originally told us, they make streets safer. The data shows there are fewer crashes on streets with trees because trees slow cars down, sometimes precipitously, but it's really good that they're there to protect the pedestrians as well. This is a Dutch artist's depiction of what a street feels like without the trees and without the parked cars. So new streets like Congress Street that disappoint us and we ask why, it's pretty easy to understand. It's the absence of trees, if not the absence of parked cars. Finally, there's the just vocabulary. Is a place swoopy? The swoopier a place is, the more it bespeaks an automotive use and not a pedestrian use. And highway engineers have imported these swoopy techniques into our communities, whether it be, the pork chop or wing-shaped median in this curve in Northampton, or just this paint unnecessarily widening the street, a lane that could go to parking in downtown Waltham. Or I found this one on the web, this incredible collection of streets intersecting in Worcester. Anything swoopy this says more pavement than it needs. It reminds me of the project we're doing in Kenmore Square. The Citgo sign is just beyond this slide to the top. You can see where we are. Another project for the same developer of my Riverside plan. Learns a lesson from what Cambridge did here. Forks are incredibly dangerous for pedestrians and bicyclists, and they're easy to fix. Here's one way to do it. As you can see in Cambridge, what we're doing here in this location is to actually take away 300 feet of one side of Commonwealth Avenue and 300 feet of one side of Beacon, and to create a new street on my client's property. It allows us to move the client's property onto this new half-acre park and create a whole bunch of more public space in Kenmore Square. This project has been approved and should be moving forward soon. And a similar thing where a space was placed in the middle of this intersection in Worcester, I think with one-way traffic around its edges, would make this a place to be. That's the safe category. The last two categories are quite quick: the comfortable walk and the interesting walk, both very important. We like outdoor living rooms. All animals, humans among them, need to feel that our flanks are protected from attack. So we want prospect and we want refuge. That's what the evolutionary biologists tell us. And without that refuge, without those street walls, a place is not comfortable. We've been talking about the ratios for a long time. What's the best? All of these are pretty good. 1-to-1 was the Renaissance ideal. Beyond 1-to-6, you don't feel contained or comfortable anymore. So Salzburg at 6-to-1 can be a dream. The opposite of Salzburg is downtown Houston. But actually, this is Houston in the 80s. This area is doing much better now, but I keep showing this slide to remind us that the surface parking lot is the principal villain in this conversation. And our best streets, whether in Haverhill or Melrose, let's stop there, have buildings on both sides of them. Newton Center, unfortunately, has this parking lot in the center of it, so it does not feel like a refuge, and it would be so easy to fix. I did a plan, a speculative plan that no one really asked for, except a developer client, to show how Newton Center could be transformed. The greenway could be made continuous. The street could be placed on either side of it as a split pair. The intersection, which causes us to have many lanes to get through the light, could be turned into a oval roundabout that allows it to be all one lane approaches. And of course, the parking lot could be moved from the center of the plaza to a structure on one side, located here or elsewhere, allowing this to be developed as a building. You know, there's hope for all of these places. Finally, the interesting walk, I talked about the 1-to-1 ratio being the ideal. I see from my alarm I have 1 minute left, so I'm going to turn it off and wind up my talk. Hold on. Done. So this is a 1-to-1 ratio. This is in Grand Rapids, but no one wants to walk on this street in an otherwise quite walkable downtown, because when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck and the other side is a conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck, it's just too boring, right? So we need to hide our boring things. We need to hide our parking decks. 20 feet of building hides 200 feet of parking or more if you do it right. Here's the Miami version. I call it the Chia Pet Garage. And then finally, there's the blank walls that make places boring. That's the place for your public art budget. Use your public art budget in a remedial way to make boring places interesting and add walkability to those dead parts of your city. This is an American version. Here's the European version, but you know, take good care of it once you have it. So that's it. Those are the 4 categories. There's so much more to say, but my time has run out. I do want to share, because I did the good job of finishing on time. I have time now to share some resources of my own that I created to make your jobs easier and to allow you to bring these ideas into your community. Walkable City has done that in a lot of cities, and if you haven't read it, I really hope you will. For those of you, many of you, probably most of you who are doing the work, I have a newer book called Walkable City Rules, which is just 101 rules, each one 2 pages, that is basically everything I know. So it's all there in one book if you want access to it. And then the talk I just gave you exists as a TED Talk that's quite popular, that you can find at TED.com. And finally, particularly for you people not too far away who don't have to pay the high cost of traveling here, I teach a course 2 days every summer at Harvard. I would love to see some of you there. It will be early June. And you can get access to that or all these other resources at my website, which is jeffspeck.com. And I hope to see some of you there. I really look forward to the conversation. I will stop sharing my screen and welcome questions.
Jeff, that was great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Don't order Jeff's book on an e-commerce website. Please walk to your local bookstore and buy that book. I'm sure it's there. I think what we're going to do now is bring in the rest of the panelists and get some reactions among all of you to what we've heard, and invite audience participation, please, as well. So put your questions into the chat and let's get that going. A couple of editorial things, Jeff. I wanted to just, you piqued my interest in a couple of things. Kelly Square in Worcester, which you showed, which is that just chaotic intersection there. There's hope, okay? There's a design that's part of the infrastructure investments going on around Polar Park, the new Red Sox or AAA Red Sox stadium out there. And if you've heard about the swoopy design, it's the amoebout, right? It's not a roundabout, it's an amoebout that they're implementing out there to kind of rationalize the traffic pattern. So there's hope out there in Worcester, and if someone from Worcester is on, please comment. And then Riverside, you talked about the Riverside project in Newton. And I know we're going to have a transit-oriented development session in 2 sessions from now. I can't help but editorialize. So this is speaking for my own, not for Langen, not for Locus. But when you talk about policy and partners in government promoting transit-oriented development and walkability, that particular site has taken how long? 15 years or more from the RFP that the MBTA put out literally a decade and a half ago to now, and it's still not built. There's got to be a better way to design a process where there are government controlled assets that are well placed, that should be turned into a neighborhood should be turned into revenue producing assets for the community. But it boggles my mind how bogged down some of these processes get to get a project like Riverside through and implemented and allow the community to reap the benefits. So that's my soapbox.
Can I add just a little bit about that? So there was an earlier plan that was so hammered down by the community in size that when it was eventually permitted, it was unbuildable.
Yep.
Right? It just wouldn't pay for itself, particularly with all the costs that involve putting the parking structure there and changing the highway access and all the things that have to happen to make it work. This plan was hammered down quite a bit, but we understand it's still quite economically viable, and it is moving forward. It is largely financed and should be breaking ground within a year. I had a little fun term I created, not NIMBYs for the people nearby, but NAMIs, not across my interstate, because most of the resistance came from a neighborhood across I-95. They have a reason. They have a reason to be concerned about traffic. You know, I don't dismiss their concerns, but the fact is that this site was in Newton's comprehensive plan for years as being a place that everyone had decided should receive a couple million square feet. And it's now finally happening at 1 million square feet.
Yeah, and it's the third developer too. So it just goes to show how long it takes. And sometimes maybe it's better to come in second in some of those than first the first time around. So anyway, great presentations, everybody. Heard of wide spectrum of perspectives on walkability. Stacy, you kind of gave us the now experience, the sort of emergent experience, right, coming out of COVID. John Robert, you gave us the economic imperatives of doing walkable places. Robin certainly shined the light on the racial and equity and social equity issues. Jeff, the tactile kind of planning and practical kinds of things that can be employed. I'll ask each of you, and I'm going to put anyone on the spot, but did you learn something from each other here? Because this has been a fascinating conversation. So I'll see Robin's nodding her head. So I'll start with you, Robin. What did you learn? And are there themes, among all of the four of you that you can take back to, your practice in the legislature?
Thanks for the question. So I learned a lot from all three of my fellow panelists. I was particularly inspired by the remarks from John about intentionally connecting economic development decisions to land use decisions. I honestly blown away to hear about the ratio of $1 of transit investment leading to 168,000 in private investment. Was that right? Yes. It was not an extra zero there, like that blow, because the Smart Growth America report that I read that I always quote is that $1 in transit investment leads to $4 in economic activity. Like, you just blew that out of the water. I want to use that argument in my city, which has high rates of unemployment and all the other things that go with that. That blew me away. I love that. And who thinks of Arkansas as the front runner in progressive, transit-oriented policymaking? Who knew? I love it.
Well, and to be clear, that wasn't just $1 investment in transit. It was in that entire project within the downtown, which is a five-block project. Transit was one of the occupants within it. But, if you get people moving in an area, then they're going to spend some money. And realize it's pretty nice. It was especially pleasing to see older Meridianites who said they would never live downtown, actually buying apartments and condominiums in the downtown because they got the notion that, hey, being able to walk to Weidman's and have dinner and maybe a glass of wine or two, then go to a theater performance at the Opera House, then walk back home, that's pretty nice life. I think I like that. And then, of course, the young people were walking to an evening and getting a beer and meeting other young people in the downtown and able to get out safely. So it was nice to see the generations mixing.
Mm-hmm. Stacy, any reactions?
I would like to respond to Delegate Lewis's comments about when she was doing her advocacy work and all of the constituents were actually wanting the same thing, but talking about it differently. And I was just on the phone with a bunch of different advocates across the state of Massachusetts yesterday and was saying the same thing. She and her neighbors and others had been working for walkability changes for the last 6 years and finally got them, and found that those same neighbors all of a sudden were against them because they didn't understand the details of what the road design was doing. So thinking about and trying to get people all on the same page, whether you're a low-income individual, an upper-class person, a Black person, a white person, a biker, a walker, like we all want the same thing, which is safer streets. And getting people to all understand that and speak the same language about that is a difficult thing, and one that takes a lot of time and a lot of process and a lot of communication and outreach, and that can turn a lot of people off, but it's such an important part of really making change. So I just wanted to echo her comments and know that we run into that all of the time in Massachusetts, and it's something that sadly we're still in business as a result. I'd love to be out of a job, but at the same time, that's why we're here. So I just wanted to remark on that. Thank you.
Stacy, how can you help Delegate Lewis create Walk Baltimore? What are some things that you've learned that you can impart here?
Well, it takes a dedicated group like the ones that she's already started to get that to happen. It's really, again, about just making sure that you can find those individuals that fight the long fight. And it sounds like she's got some starts of that, and I'd be happy to talk to her more about how Walk Boston started 30 plus years ago now, which was a small group of 4 or 5 individuals who were in the transportation industry and decided, no, we're not going to let the big dig not have pedestrian improvements and pedestrian level work. So happy to share that story with her sometime.
Great. Yes, John Robert. Yeah.
I'd like to respond to all 3 of my colleagues. First of all, Delegate Lewis, door to door. Every campaign, my staff and I would knock on every single door in Meridian, including public housing, whether the vote turnout was high there or not. I wanted them to know I cared, and to hear. And what you get at the door are very honest conversations at the door. They'll tell you exactly what they think, whether you like it or not. But it opens not only your ears, but your eyes to what an individual faces at their front door. Jeff, I didn't have the benefit of your wisdom and your expertise, but I was fortunate enough to have Jan Gale come to Meridian for 5 years in a row, speaking about walkability. And of course, he does a great presentation on public seating. And it's an involved presentation and a humorous presentation. And that helped get folks like you and Jan help get the business community to understand these larger issues that they're not going to take from the mayor who grew up in the town. They're going to need that kind of voice that's seen it across the world. And then Stacy, I'm gone from Meridian, but it depends on people like you who remain after the electeds. Come, serve, have had enough, leave. I cannot stress the importance of having dedicated zealots at the local level who simply do not give up. And yes, and you will not complete your work, unfortunately, but that's okay. You will hand it to the next person who will do it. So all 3 of you serve such an incredible function in helping our cities, large and small, transform their future.
Thank you, John Robert. Jeff, what'd you learn?
Well, I think I've spoken enough, but I've already during the proceedings, I've already emailed Robin to get a statement. Thank you very much. Stacy, you mentioned Professor Lawrence Brown's "We Can't Walk and We Can't Breathe," and I Googled that while you were talking and couldn't find it. So if you could share us with, maybe if we give you a minute before we're done, you could tell us exactly what that is so we can access it. I would just say that my whole goal in my career has been to make better places and use whatever hammer I can or tools necessary to convince people to do that. The pedestrian, you can accuse me of confusing ends with means, but the pedestrian death, epidemic that we're experiencing now has become a tremendous tool for getting people to make change in their communities. And similarly, I think surprising to some people, Black Lives Matter is another tool that's very powerful in certain places that we can use to demand these sort of changes. And I think it's really important that we work together because we're all looking for the same thing, which is livable communities in both the broad sense of the term, but also just survivable. And right now, that's a real challenge in some places.
Yeah, I would direct anyone listening to Transportation for America's report called Dangerous by Design. Perhaps you've read it. It lists the metropolitan areas in order of danger for pedestrians and cyclists. And so Florida, for example, the 5 of the top 10 most dangerous are in Florida. And who does Florida recruit to live there? Seniors. And then they're running over them for pastime. So these issues have, you need to see where your city ranks and your state ranks, and then your Department of Transportation at the state levels may say, oh, well, we can't do complete streets. You know, we can't fund. What that means is they were all trained as engineers for highways, and they don't want to learn the different way of doing it. The DOT at the federal level will say, oh, yes, you can. In fact, that's what we want you to do. So don't be afraid to go above the head of your DOT if they're not helpful.
That's a great point. And I'd be remiss to say, you know, given my role in Locus and Locus's role over the years in walkable policies at the federal level, you know, there are a couple of programs that, you know, I will just say Locus is directly responsible for creating, and that is the TOD, transit-oriented development provisions of both the TIFIA and RIF programs, which are historically low interest loans for transit infrastructure. But in the FAST Act in 2015, when that was passed, two programs were carved out of both of those programs to allow private developers to seek low interest financing for their transit-oriented development projects and the infrastructure surrounding it. So Jeff, like Riverside or any of the projects you talked about in Newton and elsewhere, you know, if there isn't a way to finance it either through the local budgets or state budgets, there is a way to seek federal money that is sitting there and waiting to be lent to private developers to promote their projects, especially around the walkability and transit-oriented aspects of it. So if you follow any of my LinkedIn posts, I'm a preacher about this and have been for many years. And now that we have Christopher Coase, who was actually Catherine's predecessor from Locus, he was the past executive director. Christopher was the author of those programs. He is now the deputy secretary under Secretary Buttigieg for policy and planning. He's in charge of those programs. So we have some real advocates at the federal level there, which is very, very encouraging. Any questions among you that I've missed or would be remiss if we didn't ask?
Stacy, did you find that link?
I did. I think I just put it in. I did put it in the chat there. I don't know if you have access to it,
good.
Jeff, but
Yes, thank you.
I did also give it to Smart Growth, so they should be able to send that out as well.
Oh, it's at America Walks. Fantastic.
Yeah,
America Walks, yep.
Thank you for doing that.
And
Yep,
Doug, assuming that Congress can actually finally act on the reauthorization bill, there are really good provisions for both TIFIA and RIF contained within that legislation that'll make it a lot easier for developers and a lot easier for mayors to do deals with developers.
Yes, and it's not well known. So, you know, stay tuned on all that stuff. And you know, I do my part on LinkedIn. Some questions here. You know, in terms of funding, Massachusetts, you know, Chapter 90. I'm sure folks on the phone here know quite a bit about that. They're weighted by population. You know, not just road miles. You know, and CDBG funds and things like that for larger cities. How do we advocate for funds for smaller communities? Again, folks that are registered for this symposium are all across the state, you know, from the smallest towns in Western Mass to Pepperell and Central Mass. How do those communities have a voice or can gain a voice in seeking additional funding? Any suggestions?
I would say build coalition, find your allies at other levels of government. So I'm no expert in this really, but I think it's just a principle, a rule of thumb that works. Folks in smaller jurisdictions can align themselves with neighboring larger jurisdictions. There may be opportunities to create like a regional coalition on the issue in question, and just work hard, lobby, scream and yell for the resources that you need. Just a thought.
At the legislative level, the state level, legislatures are rural dominant, but those rural areas all have small city centers within them where you go for healthcare and education and to, buy your weekly or daily needs. So again, picking up on what Delegate Lewis said, working those smaller cities as an alliance before the legislature to say, this isn't just about, in Mississippi's case, Jackson, Mississippi, it's about Meridian as well. And that voice has political pressure at the state level, but it also works at the federal level because the US Congress is rural dominant. And you can, if you use the right articulation, these issues we've talked about very much have a play in smaller towns and in rural places and in those Republican districts. I was a Republican mayor for 16 years. For me, there was no politics involved. It's about the people I live with and work with every single day in Meridian. And if you can tell those stories in a real way, you can move votes on Capitol Hill. And you see it in the transportation authorization bill. It was mostly coming out of Commerce, but a lot of good language there that was drafted by a Republican.
Good. We're winding down here. I want to respect everybody's time. Any last comments, questions? Let me know.
I can comment on Chapter 90 just briefly, because
Please
I know
Stacey. Yep.
one of the things that we talk about often in terms of walkability with Chapter 90 funding is that Chapter 90 funding is often used to fix potholes before it's used to do everything else. So we often encourage those cities and towns that don't have a lot of transparency in their municipal budgets to talk about that and to get more transparency to understand where that money is being spent. And also, we all need paved roads. We understand that, but they don't have to be striped the same way, right? So when you look at your repaving plans, there's a possibility of doing a short-term low-cost fix by just moving the fog line from one side, to narrow those travel lanes. So when you're looking at Chapter 90 funding and you're looking at paving plans and when those potholes are getting fixed, don't forget about slowing down traffic and moving edge lines just a little bit. So I don't have the details about how to get more funding for each individual city or town, but with the funds you do have, think about using them for walking, not just for driving.
And I'll add one comment, which is that no one pays me the big bucks to tell them to put crosswalks in because it's kind of obvious, so I don't talk about it much. But the fact is that the first step is what a lot of cities have failed to do, which is to have proper crosswalks at every intersection along every desire line. But then something you've seen a lot of cities doing really effectively lately, I've noticed it most in Jersey City in the last couple of years, also in Chicago downtown, is necking down all their intersections with paint and flags just to tighten those corner radiuses. If you want a quick first step to lowering pedestrian deaths and injuries in your city, that's where to start.
One quick thought, Doug. Part of what our country's struggling with is we no longer know who our neighbor is or understand neighborhood. Walkability allows you to meet your neighbor again. And so I think it's a great public space that we all use regardless of income. And we get to meet each other and realize we really have so much more in common than we have in difference.
And let's not let another pandemic force us to do that, right? Let's create the environment. So thank you, everybody. This has been really, really great. Thanks, Jeff, Delegate Lewis, Stacy, John Robert. Really appreciate it. Thanks to the Barr Foundation also. There will be a recording for this in the next few days. So if people want to access that, that'll be made available. There's also a survey to be filled out, I believe. So please make sure you do that. And then for those who have signed up for the 4 series, the next one is Wednesday, October 20th, starting at 2:30. And that is cultivating a Commonwealth-wide small business ecosystem. That should be really, really interesting. I'm sure we're going to tie threads among each of these symposium as we go forward. So thank you everybody for participating, and go walk. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.